Welcome back. It's good to be here with my friend Paul Thompson from Huntersville United Methodist Church. I'm Steve.Autrey from Denver United Methodist Church.
And are you sure?
I don't know. But today, I'm just coming off some dental work, so if I bite my tongue,
what we're going to get
if
today,
I
folks.
bite my tongue and say some bad words, I really expect it to be edited out.
Don't hold him accountable for anything he says today. He has no idea.
I still have half my face is numb right now.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna hand it over to you, Brother Paul. What are we talking about today?
Well, I tell you what, this is really one of those areas where when you're reading, you may think, what am I reading? This doesn't seem to have a whole lot of pertinence to what we're trying to talk about. But I'm telling you that if you ever want to understand the New Testament and you want to understand the role of Jesus, you understand why it was such an important thing that he was the son of David, as is introduced in those early Gospels and those in the beginning, the birth stories. Then this is what you need to understand today in order to recognize the absolute central nature of the story of David is connected to Jesus.
Yes. And David is, I guess you could say, an archetype of what should be. But what we'll find is even the best of humanity falls short. Right. So, but let's talk about this guy, David. Remember, Saul is first king of Israel, and much of David is set up in contrast to Saul. Saul, and if you get a chance, go to the Bema podcast. There's a great episode there. It's called "Donkey Herder is King" in reference to Saul, because Saul was out chasing donkeys when he encounters Samuel, and he's trying. So the contrast there is really interesting, that Saul would be one who would lead donkeys, whereas David is
the shepherd. Great shepherd.
And Israel is supposed to be what? They're supposed to be sheep following the good shepherd, and not donkeys. Donkeys are stubborn and hard.
Mules and stubborn and hard-headed. So when you go back to the study of Saul, first king, he came right out of central casting. He was a foot and a half, a head and a half taller than everybody else. He looked the part. He looked strong. He handsome. All of that.
And he had success early on.
And he had some success early on. It was Saul who was reticent to really take the mantle of leadership. He would prefer to stay. At one point, he's hiding among the
reticent. That's
reticent.
A big word for a Georgia boy.
I know.
Do you have a calendar?
Smart wife or something. Yeah. So Saul would prefer to not be in the position, but he is in the position. He has some success early, and then the Bible. It's always so fascinating how even the central figures of the Bible, people like Paul, people like Peter, people like David, they're never offered up in this idyllic sense. It's the true story of their life is told. And this is another one of those times when we start to talk about David. David is one of the two central figures of the Old Testament, as I interpret it. First one, obviously, being Moses, the lawgiver. But David, right alongside Moses, is one of those essential characters in the scriptures that we see God at work in, but we also see as we head toward Jesus, this archetype, as you have mentioned.
So in a sense, I think you also have to throw Elijah in there.
Elijah,
and we'll get to Elijah later. But David is so important to the narrative of the Bible, not just of First and Second Samuel, not just First and Second Kings or Chronicles, but of, who David is. David. I mean, if there was, this is not a one-to-one comparison, but I mean, David's George Washington.
Yeah,
David is to Israel what George Washington is to the United States of America.
So if Saul was the straight out of central casting, David is the opposite. David was the last son of his dad, whose name is escaping me.
Jesse.
Jesse, yes, thank you. And so when Samuel goes and tries to anoint the next king, he sees the first son of Jesse and says, "Well, surely this is the Lord's anointed."
Because he's
Nope,
tall and good
tall
looking.
and good looking, looks the part. And then finally, hey, run out of sons. Where's you got any more sons? Well, there's
The
ruddy
runt.
David out there, runt, looking after the sheep, but you don't really want to see him. And as soon as he walks in, he's summons. Uh, this is the one the Lord wants. He
Right.
was considered, he
And
called
and
ruddy
this,
complected, which may be a red haired, maybe.
I it's hard to tell. Being Middle Eastern and Jewish, it's also who knows.
We don't know.
But what we do know is that David is anointed while Saul is still king, which means Samuel has enacted this is an act of treason,
Mm.
and which is an interesting part of the narrative, but that David's already anointed king, but Saul's still on the throne. And then we get this story of David going out. The Philistines have shown up again. The Philistines show up again and again, and they're always at war with the people of Israel, and so they are coming up to enter into the land, and the Israelites have gathered. Saul has arrayed his army, and the Philistines have their army, and they send out their champion, who is Goliath, who is a big dude.
Yeah, a true giant among the soldiers.
And all of Israel is afraid of this guy, and they tremble. And Saul, it should have been the one who goes down to confront Goliath, but what we find is David shows up and he hears Goliath would come out and insult the Israelites and their God. And if you remember your scripture, David comes and goes, why are we letting this uncircumcised Philistine insult the God of Israel?
Yeah, David was bringing lunch for the boys from Dad. He was just coming to bring lunch. He was not the soldier, but he shows up. He hears this blasphemous word from Goliath against his God, and he offers to go out and take him on. And everybody's kind of snickering, and they decide to put the armor on him, and he's going to fall over from the armor, and instead says, "I'm going to take this slingshot, smooth stone, and I'm going to get the job done."
And if you Malcolm Gladwell wrote an interesting book called David and Goliath, where he digs into this story and this narrative. And it's a great book if you get a chance to read it. Also, there's a TED Talk that he does on David and Goliath. But these slings were no joke.
Mm.
These you could propel a rock at a high rate of speed, and so David takes the giant out with a with a rock.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not how we would tell the story. In our hero battles, we always have the two protagonists fight for like 25 minutes. Right? This is not how the Bible works. David just goes out and boom, it's over.
Yeah, it's done. And so what this sets the stage for is the rise of David as prominent in the life of the people called Israel, and
the decline of Saul.
And the decline of Saul.
So David comes from the lowly, Saul's exalted as king, and what you will see is David rises, Saul falls.
And yet David has a great deal of respect and love even for Saul, and refuses, even though there were so many opportunities that David could have had Saul killed.
Right, and it's important to note that David is part of Saul's household for a while.
Mm-hmm.
He plays the lyre as Saul is struggling with his well-being. To help him relax and calm down, he forms a strong bond of friendship with Jonathan, Saul's son, and yes, there are and then Saul turns on him, and David has to flee for his life, and Jonathan helps him escape. But then Saul will spend a lot of time trying to hunt down David and the people who had his band of followers. And David does have at least two different opportunities where he could have killed Saul, but he doesn't. And there's a lot to that story, but these are great stories. I think First and Second Samuel, those are they're probably my two favorite books of the Old Testament. So this is such better reading than Leviticus or Deuteronomy or Numbers.
Judges was tough. So in addition to what Steve has said, David also marries one of Saul's daughters. We see this tension between David knowing that he's already been anointed the next king, but there is a king. And so while we often tend to find ourselves pulling for David in this moment, we see him as the true anointed of God. He still refuses to be the one to kill Saul. What's so fascinating, though, is as we see the evolution of David as a person, we also see the evolution of David, who will eventually take on three prominent roles that we often hear about in the Old Testament, but then we see the echoes of this as we turn our eyes toward what Jesus will become. David ends up becoming the threefold office of prophet, priest, and king. Prophet, from the standpoint he is God's messenger. So many of the Psalms are written by David. So much of what we have the story told through David. Then we have David assuming this role of priest. At one point, as he makes the really important decision to bring the Ark of the Covenant, to set it up in the new capital called Jerusalem, David even dresses up as the priest. He leads this triumphal parade of the Ark of the Covenant coming and being settled in Jerusalem. He dances before the Lord. He dances before the Ark of the Covenant, and Saul's daughter Michal is up watching him and just aghast that he would do this. So prophet, priest, and then of course David will be eventually anointed and become the king. So prophet, priest, and king are those three offices that David really begins to fulfill in one person for the first time. And we're eventually going to find out in the New Testament that Jesus becomes prophet, priest, and king, and that threefold office becomes truly fulfilled in the life of Jesus.
And Jesus spends quite a bit of time in the New Testament talking about I am the Good Shepherd, especially in John's Gospel. So David identified as the Shepherd King. It should, and that Israel is supposed to be the sheep that are led, not the donkeys. And then when Jesus comes, he is the only one who can truly fulfill the roles of prophet, priest, and king, and be the good shepherd, and be the redeemer. So David kind of sets the template. And what's interesting with David is that Israel will always look back to David, because David is the one who unites the country.
For the first time, they become a true kingdom. From the north to the south, they have armies, they have a government, they have a system. David really does the amazing job of pulling all the tribes together, and they become one under David's kingship. One of the fascinating things that we find out about David, it's slightly alluded to in 1 Samuel, but it's actually in the book of Acts that we read the phrase that David is a man after God's own heart. Now, that phrase has always fascinated me. What would it mean? What would it take? What does it look like for someone to be a man after God's own heart? Steve alluded earlier to the fact that David was a broken, flawed human being. And you'll continue to read and you'll find out that David was a terrible parent. He wouldn't discipline his children, and he was a bad parent. He ends up committing both adultery and murder over Bathsheba. David is often too quick to act before many of the other prophets would be allowing for him to. David does stuff that he eats the showbread and this sort of stuff. There are a lot of things that David could be criticized for.
And David is a human being.
Yeah.
I mean, he's the best we have to offer, but he's still human, which means those flaws are still there. And so some lessons today from this, I think,
So, what does it take to be a man after God's own heart, a person after God's own heart, a woman after God's own heart? I think if we look at the life of David, the one thing that stands out for me was David's ability to worship.
And David's ability to, when called on his sin, he doesn't try to. He stops and he repents.
So we look at Psalms,
and he's willing to acknowledge that he failed.
Yeah.
And so if you jump ahead to Psalm 51, you'll find the psalm that David wrote after the prophet Nathan comes in and basically calls him on his
sin with Bathsheba.
Right. And so I appreciate that about David. One of the things that you see, though, a couple of things I'd just like to lift up for takeaways. I love the story when David, he tries on Saul's armor but takes it off. It's a great lesson to say, don't try to be something you're not.
Yeah.
God has given all of us certain gifts, and the Apostle Paul will outline those in the New Testament. But all of us are different. All of us have different gifts. And often we don't think of our gifts as significant sometimes. And we'll be like, well, compared to something, I don't have this or that. But God's called you to be who you are, not who you aren't. And if David had have tried to go down there and fight Goliath with Saul's armor, he would have gotten killed.
Yeah.
Because it would have impeded his ability to throw that sling around, and that would have he would not have been true to who he was. So be true to who you are.
So that psalm, that was the idea we talk about, that David could worship. Recognize that Psalm 23 is also a psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd; I shall not want. That may be among the greatest, most comforting literature, not just in biblical literature, but in all of literature.
Right.
Psalm 23 is a wonderful expression of worship, devotion to God. Steve referenced Psalm 51. So you hold those two together. David both had an amazing capacity to value the worth, the beauty, the majesty of God, and could also see himself, having been called out, have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity. David could be honest about himself. And I think those two things are critical as we think about our capacity to worship. Worship is about recognizing the majesty of God and recognizing who we are in relationship to God.
Yeah. So this Sunday at Denver, we're going to actually be talking about, we're a little off. We're not exactly same place you are, but we're going to spend some time talking about Israel wanting and claiming a king. How about you?
So yeah, we're really going to focus in on David. Steve referenced a podcast or a earlier. What was that you were saying?
Bema.
What?
BEMA.
BEMA. Okay.
Yeah, Bema podcast.
So I'm going to show the Bible Project does an awesome video. It's about 4 minutes on David and this idea of prophet, priest, and king, and where David comes from and where he ends up in the eyes of Israel. So we're going to focus on David's life as that precursor, as that archetype, as that image in which Jesus will step into when Jesus comes down the Mount of Olives on that Sunday, the triumphal entry. The people are crying out, Hosanna to the Son of David, Hosanna. And what you have to recognize is just their expectation that David was a messianic figure, but Jesus is the true anointed one of God. So we're going to draw those parallels and try to make that comparison and set the stage for the life of Jesus that we'll get to.
Yeah. So worship at 9 and 11. If Sunday school in between, and if you're interested in being a part of a Sunday school class, then just speak to me, Pastor David, Pastor Ben, and we'll point you in the right direction.
Yeah, we've got 2 new Sunday school classes. One is started around this Bible year material. By the way, Steve and his staff have done an awesome job.
You could take Steve out of that.
Okay, his staff has done an awesome job in the Bible year. I'm stealing one of these Lenten prayer companions today, bringing it back with me. But new Sunday school class based on the Bible year. Also a new Sunday school class started about the social principles of the United Methodist Church, thanks to Brad Mitchell. Also other Sunday school classes from Jan Lanning, Bill Miller, lots of others. I hope you'll find. So we're at 8:30 and 10:30 this week at Huntersville.
All right. Well, thank you, and look forward to seeing you on Sunday.